Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today I'm going to share 3 stories that all demonstrate that. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to beautifully and meticulously detail the like button's car. But when you take possession of their car, just fill it with water and then leave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. Late at night on October 26, 1968, a 72-year-old woman named Ethel Harris was sitting in her living room in Toledo, Ohio, when her phone rang. And the first thing she did when it rang was looked at the clock. It was 10:30 p.m. This is not when people called her. And so worried something was wrong, she got up and she answered the phone and she said hello. And on the other end of the line, somebody said back, "Hey sis." And Ethel immediately knew who this was. It was not a sibling, despite the greeting, "Hey sis." It was someone that was very close with her and her husband, Dawn. In fact, this person who she was speaking to was Dawn's best friend, a 59-year-old man named Lee Epps. And for decades, Lee and Ethel and Dawn had lived next to each other. They were neighbors, and basically every day they were at each other's houses together. I mean, they were super duper close. But Lee had eventually moved to another town, and so they didn't see each other as much, but they did get together a fair amount. And also Lee, very regularly, would call the house and just check in. And so Ethel's thinking, okay, it's a little bit late, 10:30 at night, but it's Lee, so clearly he's just calling to check in. But before Ethel could really even respond to his greeting of, "Hey sis," because that's what he called her, sis, he just kept on talking. It was as if, Ethel wasn't even there. He was just sort of delivering a message. He was like, "Hey sis, I'm feeling really bad. I've never felt this way before. And, I really need your husband, Dawn, to get in touch with me the moment he gets back." And then Lee hung up. And Ethel, after, the phone call died, she was really confused because one, it seemed like a sort of normal catch-up call, but he's saying something that sounded really serious, that, something's going on with him. But also two, what immediately stood out to her was, how did he know Dawn wasn't there at the moment? He wasn't nearby. How could he have just guessed that Dawn wasn't home right now? Because Dawn wasn't. He was out. He was going to be home soon, but he was out at the time he said it. It was like he had this knowledge that he was gone. And so it just seemed odd that he knew that piece of information. And so because she was sort of confused by this call and worried about Lee, considering what he said, she tried calling him back. But Lee didn't answer. She tried several more times, never heard from Lee. And then eventually her husband, Dawn, he came home and she explained to him yeah, I got this weird call from Lee. He said, he wanted you to get in touch with him as soon as he came back because he's not feeling good or something. I don't really know. And so Dawn's like, all right, that's weird. So he tries calling Lee and Lee doesn't answer. And so at this point, Dawn, he's like, "Ethel, go over it again. What exactly did he say? Did he sound scared? Did he sound confused? What was he talking about?" And Ethel said, I don't know. He just sort of stated that he just didn't feel good and he had never felt this way before and he just really wanted to talk to you, Dawn. But again, he mentioned you were out of the house. I don't know how he knew that. And he said to have you call when you came back. That's really what happened. I don't understand it either. And so because Ethel and Dawn really didn't know what to make of this, and just given the fact that maybe Lee could be in trouble, they were like, you know what, let's just drive over to his house in the other town and just check on him. Just make sure he's okay. So they hop in the car, they drive to Lee's house, and Lee's not there. And so even though it was late at night, Ethel and Dawn really were worried about their friend, and so they began knocking on neighbors' doors to see if anybody knew where he was. But it would take a while, but eventually one of the neighbors said that Lee actually was at the hospital. And at this, Ethel and Dawn, it's like their worst fears are confirmed. Something really is wrong with their friend. And so they went to the nearest hospital, which is called Mercy Hospital. And when they got there, they learned that yes, Lee was admitted to the hospital, but unfortunately, he was dead. And this on its face was of course shocking news for Ethel and Dawn. I mean, they did not expect to find out that their friend of many decades was, abruptly and sort of inexplicably dead. But that was far from the most shocking thing they learned. When they spoke to the medical staff about what actually happened to Li, they would eventually tell Ethel and Dawn that after some complications, Li ultimately passed away at precisely 10:30 p.m. the previous night. His actual time of death exactly coincided with the moment Ethel got that phone call from Li, where he said to her, "I just don't feel right. I've never felt this way before. Please, when your husband Don gets home, have him call me." Ethel and Dawn have no way to prove this, but they believe that that phone call was actually Li's spirit, his soul, trying to talk to his best friend one more time before he passed away. Thank you to DraftKings Sportsbook for sponsoring today's episode. I love to place bets during the playoffs, no matter the sport. The playoffs are just awesome. There's nothing like betting on a game when everything is on the line. It just makes it so much better. Do you love the thrill of live betting? Do you want to wager on the next big play or your favorite player's next move? Well, DraftKings has you covered. And there's even a special offer for new customers. Bet $5 and get paid in bonus bets if your bet wins. Minimum minus 500 odds required. Stay in on the action and use your bonus bets on DraftKings same-game parlays for a shot at an even bigger payout. And if for some reason sports betting is not yet available in your state, don't fret. You can still join in on all the fun with DraftKings Pick 6 and have the shot to win cash prizes. New customers bet $5 and get extra bonus bets if your bet wins. Minimum minus 500 odds required. The crown is yours. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app and sign up using promo code MrBallen. Again, that's promo code MrBallen. One afternoon in the summer of 2006, a 70-year-old man named Ma Qingmao and several of his family members walked out of their house in Luoyan Village, which was a very small community in rural China. Luoyan Village was known for being this beautiful, historic place, and as Qingmao and his family walked along, they passed by these beautiful, lush fields and saw these tall mountains off in the distance. But they also passed by something that made Qingmao and his family all very sad. The charred remains of dozens of burned out buildings were just littering the landscape. So Qingmao had lived in this village his whole life, and he remembered when it really was this happy, tight-knit community of over 100 people, and it really was just this picturesque place to live. But 3 years ago, that had all changed, and life in this village really became one disaster after another. There had been not one, but two enormous fires, which were caused by faulty wiring, but they had destroyed all these homes and businesses and all these historic buildings. I mean, it really kind of like changed the entire face of this town, and they still hadn't rebuilt it yet. But as bad as those fires were, it was actually what happened after the fires stopped burning that really, really made this place a nightmare on earth. And it was that for whatever reason, the mortality rate in this little village in China just spiked like mad. It was like all these people were just dropping dead out of nowhere. And it got to the point where the villagers were scared that like some illness was plaguing them, some unseen plague they didn't even know. And it got so bad, so many people were dying, that they brought in the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC. They came in and actually did a full-blown investigation of this village. And they concluded that there is no connection between all these deaths. All these people that are dying in your village are dying from common illnesses or old age. Like, these are natural deaths. It's just this sort of anomalous spike in the mortality rate, and it's unfortunately, following this horrible tragedy, which were these fires. So it's basically like a tragic set of coincidences that these terrible things are befalling the village all at the same time. But a lot of people, including Qingmao, didn't buy that what was happening was natural. Instead, a lot of people began to think that their village was cursed. And so Qingmao and his family, they walked past all these burned out buildings, and they made their way towards the center of the village where there was a temple. because there was going to be yet another funeral for another person in their village, a young woman who had died inexplicably, at least in the eyes of the villagers. It didn't make sense she had died, but apparently it's a natural cause according to the CDC, but they were going to another funeral. And so into the temple they went, and before long the procession began. Later that night, Qing Mao stumbled his way through the dark streets of the village towards his home. Following that funeral, Qing Mao and his family had gone to the deceased woman's family home for this big ceremonial dinner that was typical after these funerals. And Qing Mao's family, they had basically left pretty much right after the meal itself. But Qing Mao, he was feeling kind of down, like many people in the village, considering their sort of cursed status as they believed. He had stayed behind, and he had continued eating and drinking some alcohol and talking with his neighbors. Now he was finally on his way back home. But as he walked, he suddenly felt this really sharp pain in his gut, and it hurt so bad that it was making it really hard to walk. And so Qing Mao clutched his stomach and really had to force himself to keep moving one foot in front of the other. And then finally, when he got to his home, he opened up the front door, but the pain was so blinding that he just screamed out for help and then collapsed onto the ground right inside the house. And then Qing Mao, as he's laying on the ground, he began vomiting uncontrollably onto the floor. And then he just passed away right there, right in front of his whole family. Now, Qing Mao himself was not like a hugely influential person in this village. He'd been there his whole life, and everybody knew him, of course. But there was just something about his death that felt really monumental. It was like everybody in the village felt it, that when he died, for no apparent reason really, it just felt like enough is enough. There is no way these deaths that have ravaged our village are natural. It's not possible, and we will not take that as an answer any longer. And so the village director, who basically is like the mayor of the village, he wound up getting in touch with the provincial health department, and he told them what was going on and what the CDC had already communicated to them and how they didn't buy it. And so this health department, they sent out 20 experts to this village, and they did this big investigation to try to figure out, is there something causing all these deaths? Is it linked to the fires in some way? What's going on in this village? And you know what they came up with? Well, turns out it's all natural. There's nothing wrong here. We believe what the CDC said. There's basically no issues whatsoever. You have nothing to worry about. And the village said, no. We still don't believe that. This is not acceptable. And so they went back to their village director and they said, you gotta do something else because this is not acceptable. And he agreed. And so he actually got in touch with the police, just the local police, and said, hey, you come in, you investigate this. Try to see if there's something, anything that they have missed that could maybe explain why so many people are dying in this village. And so the police, they come into this village and they do this broad strokes, very wide sweeping investigation, and they do find something. And what they discover completely explains what's going on in this village. It would turn out the village's doctor, their one doctor, was this guy named Ma Foman. And Ma was not really a doctor. He had basically read a couple of medical books. That was the extent of his training. He was not a doctor. And so he's the guy they're going to whenever they have any medical issues, and he has no idea what he's doing. But he benefited from people getting sick because he's the town doctor. And so you have this guy who can't help you, pretending to help you, likely making it worse, who profits from illness in this village. So that's bad. But it gets worse. Ma was also the owner of the funeral home in this village, the one funeral home. So if his crock science, his crock medicine didn't save you, or if you didn't inexplicably get better basically on your own and you died, he also profited on you. So basically, Ma Foman had a monopoly on suffering in this village. If you got sick, he made money. If you died, he made money. The only way he didn't make money is if you lived. And for a while, Ma Foman just kind of allowed this setup to run as is. He didn't influence it at all. He just was a fake doctor and was the funeral director. But in time, he wanted more money, and so he began poisoning the village's water supply with cyanide, because then you have more people getting sick, makes more money, and more people dying, makes more money. But even that still wasn't enough for Ma Foman. He needed more death and suffering. And so those fires, that was not faulty wiring. That was just luck on Ma Fo Man's part that he wasn't caught. That was pure arson. He burned that place down, killing people in the process. Because again, he's got this monopoly on death and suffering in this village. And so in the end, the police who came in, they did this investigation and they discovered that those fires were actually arson, and it eventually led back to Ma Fo Man. In total, Ma Fo Man killed 76 people. All people that he lived with. These are like his friends and his family. These are his people. He killed 76 of them. And so he was ultimately convicted of murder and he was sentenced to death. One morning in September of 1893, a 25-year-old man named Paul Marsh sat at a dining room table inside of his aunt's house in New Haven, Connecticut. He was there with his mother and his father to visit his aunt, whose name was Miss Blackwood, and also to visit his 19-year-old cousin, whose name was Madeline. Madeline was being looked after by Miss Blackwood because her parents had died 4 years ago, making her an orphan, and Miss Blackwood certainly had the means. She was very wealthy, and so she took Madeline in. And so basically that was her new de facto mother. And so Paul, his parents, and Madeline, they were all having this big, luxurious breakfast that Miss Blackwood's housemaid had prepared for them, and they were waiting for Paul's aunt to wake up and come downstairs and join them. And this was not just like a formality because it was her house and they were, trying to be respectful. No, actually, they loved Miss Blackwood. I mean, Paul's aunt was awesome. She was super energetic and she was really fun. And of course, she was like very wealthy and her house was awesome. And so family generally loved to visit with Miss Blackwood. And so basically everybody's waiting for her to get up to start the day for real. But after a while, when Miss Blackwood had not come downstairs, the group just began eating their breakfast and just figured, maybe she's taking her time and we'll catch up with her, after breakfast or something. So everyone's eating their food and just chatting and having a nice morning, when suddenly the housemaid who had stepped away a few minutes earlier, she comes running into the kitchen. She's very upset and she just yells out that Miss Blackwood is dead. And for a second, Paul was totally confused because just the night before, his aunt had seemed completely normal and healthy. There were no signs that she had any health issues whatsoever. But the family followed the housemaid up to Miss Blackwood's bedroom, and they went inside, and sure enough, there was Paul's aunt laying in bed, cold to the touch. She was definitely dead. Later that morning, Paul and his very distraught family met with Miss Blackwood's regular doctor in the living room of her house. The doctor had just finished examining her body, and he said that, Miss Blackwood really didn't have any clear signs of illness or injury. But he said, she's 70 and she had suffered from heart disease for the last few years, and so very likely heart disease is what ultimately killed her. Now, for the most part, the family all reacted with a mix of obviously sadness, but also like, okay, that logically makes sense. And Paul himself, he felt the same way. He's like, that's really awful. I can't believe she's gone. It makes sense, but he also had this weird feeling that he couldn't quite describe, that just, he felt like something's off here. He couldn't articulate it, but he just immediately had this sense that could not be the story, that something else happened to his aunt. But Paul didn't say anything to his family. He felt like it was kind of inappropriate to immediately start, suggesting conspiracies about what could have happened to their aunt when, again, logically, it did make sense what the doctor was saying. And so Paul just kind of kept it to himself. But he didn't stop thinking about it. Once the doctor left, Paul and his family decided that they would all just stay in Miss Blackwood's house. They had a funeral to plan, they had to deal with her will and her estate. I mean, there was all these things that were left to do. And the family had already decided they were gonna come here and stay for a bit for a visit, so they'd already booked off this time. So the decision was they would just stay and try to sort of help get through this transition process. Fast forward 5 weeks. And Paul and his family are still staying in Miss Blackwood's house, largely because it was proving to be very difficult to sort of manage her estate. She was quite wealthy and going through her will and everything. It was just a huge mess. And so they were still there and they were still trying to figure things out. And by this point, Paul really didn't have a big role in any of that. He was just kind of there really to support his parents as they dealt with the estate. But Paul had kind of taken up his own mission secretly. He hadn't told people about his suspicions that something else must have killed his aunt. He didn't want to tell people that. He felt like he was kind of crazy for thinking it because he had no reason to think it other than a gut feeling. But he had begun sort of investigating. And his investigation had led him to begin sleeping in his aunt's bedroom because he had this belief that maybe his aunt's ghost would visit him in her bedroom and she would tell him or signal to him in some way what really happened to her. Now, for the past several days and weeks that he'd been in here, he had not seen his aunt's ghost. But he was not about to give up, at least not yet. So, on this particular night, this is again 5 weeks after his aunt has passed away, Paul is in his aunt's bedroom, he's in her bed, and he's laying there and he's getting ready to fall to sleep. As he's laying there, he begins to hear a strange sound over to the side of the room. It sounded almost like scratching noises. And the room is very dark. It's late at night. There's a window, but there's not much light coming in from the moon. It's just kind of dark in this room. And he opens his eyes and he rolls over and he looks over in the direction of this scratching sound. And he can't see anything at first. But then as his eyes kind of adjust to the darkness, he realizes he sees something that he can't believe. I mean, even though in some ways he was hoping to see this, but he sees a hand, like a disembodied hand, actually a whole arm, is basically reaching out of the wall in his direction. And for Paul, he's obviously never seen anything like this before, and he should be terrified. I mean, he's basically seeing a ghost, but he's not scared. He's thinking, this is it, my plan is working. My aunt is signaling to me. She's gonna tell me in some way, shape, or form here what really happened to her. It's finally happening. And so with really no fear, Paul gets out of his bed, walks over to the disembodied arm reaching out of the wall, and he grabs it. After Paul grabbed the ghost arm, screams filled the whole house, woke everybody up, and Paul's father came running down the hall. He burst into the aunt's bedroom and he sees his son and he sees what his son is grabbing. And he really can't even begin to process it. It would turn out there really was an arm reaching through the wall. But it wasn't a ghost arm. It was not, Miss Blackwood's ghost coming back to tell Paul about what happened to her. But this arm did absolutely have something to do with what killed Miss Blackwood, because she did not die of heart disease. When Miss Blackwood was still alive, the person who lived in the room next to her, where they slept, they drilled a hole in the wall big enough for their arm to fit through, and they reached through that hole at night while Miss Blackwood was asleep, and they poured poison into the water she kept by her bedside. They poisoned her to death. And then after she died from being poisoned, it was determined that she had died from cardiac arrest, and pretty much everybody accepted that, except for Paul. The killer was aware, even though Paul was keeping it to himself, that he was on to something. He was sleeping in Miss Blackwood's bedroom. It seemed like he was trying to figure out if there was more to the story than what everybody else seemed to believe, which was heart disease. And when it seemed to the killer like Paul really was getting close to figuring something out, the killer waited for Paul to be in the same bed, and he had a water next to his bed as well. The killer reached through and tried to do the same thing to Paul that they had done to Miss Blackwood. They tried to pour poison into his drink to kill him. But Paul was looking for a ghost in the room. He heard the sound of the arm coming through, and he grabbed the arm thinking it's his aunt's arm, but he really actually was stopping the arm from putting poison in his drink, and the screams were the sound of the killer realizing they've been caught. And the killer was none other than Paul's own cousin, the 19-year-old Madeline. After her parents died, Miss Blackwood took her in like her own child. And because she adopted Madeline, she put Madeline on her will. She was going to inherit Miss Blackwood's wealth. And Madeline just couldn't stand waiting for Miss Blackwood to die in order to get that wealth. And so she decided she would kill her. After Madeline was caught, she quickly confessed to Paul and his parents that yes, she had done it. And so Paul and his parents sent for the police to come out here and arrest Madeline for murder and also attempted murder of Paul. But before the police could even get there, Madeline suddenly began bleeding heavily from her mouth, and then she collapsed and died. It's not clear what actually killed her, but it's entirely possible, if not likely, that she actually used the same poison she had used to kill her aunt on herself to avoid facing justice. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.